Here, here.
Hi, let me just set up my camera and my timer.
All right.
Hi, asking for audibility and visual check.
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Great. Hi. Hello, I am Renz de Leon. I will be the member of the opposition, or I'm gonna be the leader of the opposition for this debate. Pronouns, I don't really care. You can use whatever you want to do. Few eyes preferably at the 5th minute mark by voice, because I won't be able to see chat again by voice. I'll take you. Um, as for before I start my speech, I think I have the ability to do so. I'll just like to give a few shout outs. My SBTS partners here, Lernella. Hi, girl. Thanks for spectating. I think some of my kids from debate are here as well. Thanks for spectating and supporting. And my girlfriend is also here. Thanks, April, for being so supportive. And shout out to SBTS. Because some won't be able to be here, sadly. But yeah, again, true voice, 5th minute mark, pronouns, I don't really care. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I think the biggest problem and what OG is contingent on is that the UN has no resources and it's a bad, and that scenario is bad in the first place. But take note, the UN has the incentive of the collective security, for example, because the UN Charter exists, which was completely disregarded by opening government, like the founding document of the United Nations, which establishes the principle of collective security. More likely, the member states commit to collective action to maintain international peace security, for example, in the scenarios where problems do arise, i.e., USA and Australia actually opting in to support the problems when it does arise. This means that when there is a threat in peace, a peace is identified, member states agree to cooperate and respond to it in the first place because UN peacekeeping is one of the ways the organization implements its principles in the first place. Meaning, of course, checks and balances still exist. But secondly, OG assumes that you can just opt out once you feel like they aren't operating anymore. But one, it's likely that they won't cooperate most of the time. I'll expound on why that's like the case in the later. But two, once you invite the devil into your doorstep, it's hard to tell the devil to go away. Literally, there's no incentive analysis for them to be able to prove why these actors would be able to be good and why they would align with your principles in the first place, especially the UN peacekeeping principle. And I don't think they were actually able to prove why it's easy to make them go away in the first place. Like once they're in your state, it's hard to shoo them away. They can just move around in like your state, for example, and it's hard to mitigate them. I.e., look at the Wagner group in Russia when they started to like leave the Russian, for example, they were able to do a lot of damages and conflict within the Russian state before they were shooed away and before they went to Belarus, for example. Literally, no proof of analysis on why it's going to be the case on opening government. I think that already boxed them out as early as my responses. But onto the push then. But actually, before I move on to my pushes, let's just frame it a bit. What are paramilitary groups in the first place? Usually, these are military groups that separate from a state. Look at mercenaries in Africa, for example, that are paid and hired by other states. What does this imply? That one, that they don't carry one set ideology. They are probably from diverse backgrounds, for example. This means that they do a variety of things that does not align with the UN peacekeepers' principles or the ideology. But two, is that even if government can ensure or they have fiat that they all have one preset ideology, it still has higher barrier on the comparative to align with the UN peacekeepers' ideology as well. This is likely because usually these groups are more money centered, meaning they're incentivized to do shit or to do bad shit based on the money that they're receiving, not just on mere peacekeeping alone that the peacekeepers or the UN peacekeepers are pushing forward. I think government will come in and say, well, they have incentives to do good because they get paid since they're money driven, like from my framing. But that cannot be the case because they still follow their own ideologies, which is more predominant from them. But under this is just the lack of check and balances for these actors once the UNP opts into this in the first place. This is likely to be the case because they operate on their own plans and own idea, even with the planning from the UNP that does not give the government fiat that these people will just follow and be like all Hail Mary and butterflies and rainbows. Humans don't exist in a vacuum, and with their own perceived incentives, it's more true then the harms are likely to be exacerbated on side government. I think deputy and closing government has to mitigate this, and that if they don't, it's likely to be the case. But secondly, these are UN peacekeepers, nuance on peacekeepers, so probably their best and most proximate interest is to uphold the peace, and I don't think this is likely to be the case in government. 3 layers under this, and why it's the case. First is that it erodes the UN's principle on neutrality and legitimacy, and this is likely to be the case because separate from these parameters having their own or parameters having their own ideologies is that there's a likelihood that they are run by other more powerful states, i.e. Wagner Group of Russia, now Belarus because they transitioned, and of course this is also us engaging on PM's framing that some of them do align with other states, meaning paramilitary groups often have affiliation with specific governments, for example, factions or interests, and this is likely to create the perception that the UN is taking sides in conflicts, for example, at the point in time they opt into using these paramilitary groups. Sure, government can push that this is an assumption, but take note of historical analysis, because in past conflicts, accusations of bias or partiality have been directed at the UN peacekeeping missions when they have been seen as cooperating with or relying on paramilitary groups with political or ethnic ties in the past, meaning at the point in time that they do opt into this, the paramilitary groups, for example, is the point in time that they heighten the accusations that they will receive and heighten the non-credibility of themselves and their principles in of themselves, which is highly likely to be the case. This is the direct harm to themselves, which lessens their incentive to opt into paramilitary groups at the point in time this debate is happening. Before I move on, I'd like to take closing. Opening.
Presumably, the UN peacekeeping force currently is also consisted of soldiers from multiple nations. Why is it? Why are you able to change the scenario significantly?
Yeah, that's the point, right? Because they are under the UN, so technically they still have one aligning ideology. The problem is if you opt into paramilitary groups, they have very much more varying and much more diverse perspectives, and that's likely to be much more problematic and harder to mitigate. Once problems do arise, I think you need to engage with this then. But lastly, it's just very unpredictable analysis and risk it comes with that may further exacerbate the problems the UNP is experiencing. Because even if we do engage, and even if we do concede that problems are like UN is experiencing problems on shortages, for example, paramilitary groups can have shifting alliances and loyalties, making it challenging to predict their behavior and their decision-making process. And this is likely to be the case, especially with the framing from PM and the framing from my third layer. The problem is that this is unpredictable and introduces risk to the UN peacekeeping missions, for example, as paramilitary groups may switch alliances and allegiances or engage in activities contrary to the mission's goals, for example. And I think that's likely to be the case because take note, if most of these people are aligned with, i.e. China, for example, who has their very, very perverse and selfish interests, or probably aligned with other states, for example, that have their own interests, then likely you're going to have a hard time once new problems do arise to actually ratify these problems in the first place. I think likely, even if the missions are in need and dire need to finish them, you likely won't have the ability to finish them alongside government once new problems arises. And those problems are likely to be so because of the framing that you got at the earlier part of my speech. But secondly, we say UN peacekeeping operations require a high degree of coordination and cooperation among various actors. The involvement of paramilitary groups with uncertain loyalties will probably disrupt this coordination and potentially compromise the mission's objectives and the objectives of the UN, like the UN peacekeepers, for example. Just to tie it back and ground it down. Of course, since the UN peacekeeping want to keep themselves credible, if they keep failing from these missions because they keep opting into problematic actors, for example, then likely you won't get the benefits that they want to get in the first place, and they don't get the buy-in from the other state that they want to co-op in the first place. In some form of way, if some conflicts, like paramilitary groups have changed sides, for example, or pursue their own agenda, for example, this leads to more complex and unpredictable situations for peacekeeping forces, and likely they lose the buy-in that you try to fight for in the first place on-site government. So sure, even if the problems do exist, I think the point in time that you opt into paramilitary groups is the point in time you exacerbate the problems that they're experiencing. I think it's by far better that you fix it on-site government because you have the UN that you are able to co-op or opt into once you need the help from the first place. I think they have clear incentives why that's going to be the case. Oppose.
All right, then let's speaker for that speech. Can we now invite the Deputy Prime Minister? Here.
Can I just check I'm audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. POIs in chat, please. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. The most important benefit in this debate will always be increasing the ability of the UN to save lives in a time of conflict. This looks like the Rwandan genocide, where the UN was unable to do things like step in effectively or quickly. It looks like in crises like where certain insurgent movements in Africa are threatening people locally in the state as a whole. You need to be able to step in and help allies and help civilians and deliver things like food and water. That is always going to keep people alive and is always the most proximate benefit. What am I going to do in the speech is I'm going to explain what these paramilitary organizations likely look like. Most of my responses to OO will be here. Just note that lots of their case is really negative without explaining what the comparative is likely to look like in dealing with our benefits. Then I'm going to talk about why we get more effective intervention, and then I'm going to talk about why it's always beneficial on the comparative to have more options available. So, what do these paramilitary organizations look like? We told you at PM that they're likely to be chosen in a considered trade-off, i.e. the value or utility must outweigh the potential things like human rights violations or the risk of them leaving or bailing. And it's likely to be an informed decision because the UN doesn't want to be embarrassed in front of its member states because it wants to be seen as doing things that are valuable. It also has a mission to protect people, which it takes very seriously, but also it has access to things like information networks and from allied countries who supply them with that. They also have top star generals who work for the UN, supplied from the best possible talent pools. They also are likely so these groups are also likely to want to achieve UN goals. Why? Because paramilitary groups have to feed and provide comfort for their members. That means when we are paying them, rather than them having no source of income, they're likely to draw from this. But also, they're probably not likely to be monsters as well, simply because they only want to make economic decisions, as OO explains. But also, they're probably just not likely wanting to piss off the entire UN and the entire member states that threaten that, because note that is what's likely to happen at the point where you enter a deal and then you draw the ire of countries you don't want to, you draw the ire of the press. That is not what you want to do. You want to stay under the radar, or you want to do good things in the hope that you're able to gain more deals in the future. OO tells us that these groups may be doing things that are bad / have their own ideologies. 1. Now that we get an increased likelihood of them doing not bad things. So rather than turning to things rather than turning to states who might get them to do bad things, now now we give them money to do good things. I think that's a better comparative and approximate benefit in and of itself. OO then explains that, they might be potentially biased towards bad actors, and that the UN will be seen as taking a side towards those bad actors. 1. It's unclear why this is true, because these paramilitary groups are independent. If they're not, then they're probably not a paramilitary group in the sense that Wagner's not a paramilitary group. It's an extension of the Russian military. But also, I think you just have to trade off the benefits here, because sure, the UN might be seen as potentially being biased, but that obviously isn't that relevant, because the UN, there's plenty of other reasons the UN might be seen as biased. They're literally entering a conflict zone. Then OO explains, but it might be hard and challenging to predict them, and they may shift alliances. 1, it's unclear why they would do this. We explained that it's likely to piss off the UN, which is not something they want to attract the eye of. But also, it probably is quite easy to predict them, because, as OO concedes, they are done, they're led through economic incentives, but also you just have access to intelligence, things, and that sort of stuff. I think that means, and you're probably able to predict them, you're probably able to avoid the worst. They said, but it may cause problems when they leave, but obviously they're now tied to you for economic sustenance, they're tied to you not to embarrass you, and they have increased oversight. That means they're more likely to do bad things when otherwise they might not have had that oversight. They may not have access to good money rather than blood money. I'll take OO's POI.
Your PM says that a lot of these paramilitary groups are hinged on states. Now you're just rebutting your prime minister. You're
No, I'm not.
killing
There's
your
different
bench.
kinds of paramilitary organizations. Okay, moving on. So now I'm going to talk about why we get more effective intervention. 1, the key benefit we get here is that we're more likely to get people who are locally sourced. For example, the Kurds in Turkey or locally backed militias in sub-Saharan Africa. They're able to know the layout in places of conflict, which means you're better able to do things like interventions. They're able to, negotiate between warlords when normally you wouldn't have that, or normally that would have been seen as a bad look for the UN. Now you can get paramilitary organizations to do it on your behalf and potentially have the increased capacity to reduce violence. But also, you're more likely to look like the communities they're entering. So when the UN, who is composed of different races and enters these communities which might be quite suspect to them because they might be anti-West and suspect of a global force coming into their community, they're more likely to know them, they're more likely to be friends or allies with them, they're more likely to be able to tolerate them in the community, and you're able to get information out of them. That fulfills the UN's role of reducing conflict earlier. Obviously that's a benefit, but also we save people's lives. But the second thing is we get the benefit of not having to go through all the red tape that is raising a UN peacekeeping force. We tell you the likely comparative is you having to raise an army from multiple different nations, as OO concedes. That's really important because it means you're able on our side to get forces quicker into action, who are more likely to have expertise on the ground and are more likely to be effective. And note, these are the most proximate benefits in this debate. It's people being able to live to see the ends of their lives at the point where a conflict is reduced earlier. It's people feeling safe in the conflict to the point where they see people that they know representing them rather than a foreign UN peacekeeping force. And the militias that they're more likely to be familiar with. And to ordinary people, they're probably more, and for businesses and stuff, you're more likely to see stability of countries. But the second benefit is that we have more options available. One, you're able to use funds to enter and intervene in disaster zones that you previously couldn't. This is a hugely proximate benefit, and it's likely because, one, when you have to raise an entire army, you're not able to enter the conflict, but often the UN can't enter conflicts that paramilitary organizations can. Look at the Kurds in the Middle East, or militias in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a huge benefit. We get businesses, supply chains, and people secured in their lives. The second thing is the benefit of being able to not draw from allied nations. The US is really skeptical of the UN drawing their troops. Nations are really pissed when the UN has to raise an army all the time, which is why no one did anything in the Rwandan genocide. That's really bad. We're able to draw from different places. We're able to get people saved earlier. That's a massive benefit that we bring to you at opening government.
All right, then it's speaker for that speech. Can we now invite the DLO? Here.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yeah, you can be heard.
Okay. My name is Matthew, pronouns he, him, POIs through chat. Please do not unmute yourself. I'll take one. I'll try to take one. Okay. So, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Until recently, the annals of history have held within the chilling narrative of World War I, an anti-cataclysm crash defined by the massive mobilization of troops, the unrelenting horror of trench warfare, the stagnant battle lines that seem impervious to change, and the war's culmination within Germany's defeat, sealed by the ratified Paris Peace Conference. Yet, within this kind of retrospect, a parallel world emerged, a shadowy realm where countless paramilitary fighters wielding extra violence accrued. It is this world fraught with complexities and consequences that the proposition envisions on resurrecting. That's why the Gov bench has to lose in this debate. First, pushland. Just like what our first speaker said, the neutrality paradox is very likely to accrue. While the intention behind hiring paramilitary groups might enhance the effectiveness of peacekeeping operation, it paradoxically targets the core principle of neutrality that internal peace organization ought to do. These paramilitary groups often have their own agendas, just like what Lauren said, which can compromise the impartiality of UN peacekeepers. Take note, for example, a paramilitary groups, other states sometimes, a paramilitary groups has harmed people from Afghanistan, if hundreds, if not thousands of civilians on their neighboring countries. Like, how would OO and CG defend that this would not lead to internal conflict and harms in the UN as a whole? Also, there are numerous of nations that already perceives UN as a bad state group due to their conflict of interest, like how Duterte hates UN and curses by them week by week due to this. Imagine how bad this image of fighting this kind of internal conflict that could lead to another external conflict when other states speak up about the moral principle violation of this paramilitary group that can again result to non-UN members to be perceived again as a bad military principle. How can you prove that it would not be abused by this kind of nation that hates UN and further puts their image into the dust, and at least their keep peacing forces? This is where the clear comparative that you get from LO. We consider that the harms exist. Answer ought to be fixed, like i.e. the Rwanda genocide. But the problem is, and this was clear from LO, that this is no by means they do they fix these things. Most of their arguments and harms can be flipped over their heads. Like bad look of UN has already been preempted by LO. At the point in time you opt into this kind of narrative, there's a heightened chance that you get called out by the UN. And when you fail, you are more likely and when you fail, they're more likely their DPM already failed to respond to 4 layers of analysis that ensures that the harms do exist. But the TPMs attacks their PMs. PM clearly stated that this looks like US black ops, and he even said that there are multitudes of different paramilitary groups. At no point do they ensure why this is likely to not be the case. The minuscule chance of harms happening is something OO avoid. So take note, this peacekeeping forces of UN already has a bad rep on keeping internal conflicts, like how they failed to protect US and Afghanistan war, and putting them into this kind of notion that would just elevate the hardship that they endure to maintain their driving factor and integrity. The assault to the current military forces that they have within these groups are likely, but the benefits that we get from this external paramilitary group are too uncertain. Paramilitary groups are used to operate outside the frameworks of internal national law and accountability. It is already innate in their nature. Involving them in this kind of peacekeeping missions can create ethical quagmire, making it too difficult to hold individuals and entities responsible for violation. Who would be responsible if they leak an internal conflict within the UN? Who would be responsible when they opt out after receiving all of the internal information that they need to pursue their agendas on how these military groups can just harm any existing peacekeeping bases due to their database being leaked? While hiring this kind of paramilitary group may offer a long-term tactical uncertain advantages, it can certainly jeopardize the long-term stability and peace-building efforts in conflict zones. Sustainable peace often requires focus on diplomacy and institution building and trust building, and UN took a very, very long history to develop this kind of notions rather than relying this kind of armed groups. So why would we destroy all of the hard works of the UN that they did? The UN jeopardizes its credibility and trustworthiness as a neutral mediator in global conflicts. Why would you hire a paramilitary group that already have a bad retrospect of an image then? Another point then, upholding the principles of sovereignty and consent in peacekeeping mission is paramount. Allowing paramilitary groups to operate within a nation's border without their consent is infringing on these principles and can provoke hostilities within the affected countries. So why is this true? UN does not announce what kind, what nationality, what age, and what type of military do they send within their peacekeeping military bases. Also, layers of analysis again then. Paramilitary groups have implicitly in numerous cases have human rights abuses worldwide. Involving them in peacekeeping forces could tarnish UN's reputation and raise concerns about this kind of complicity violation. Does UN consider this kind of metric? Does the involvement of paramilitary group introduces an element of unpredictability into this kind of peacekeeping operation? Take note then, involving paramilitary group whose motivations and actions are often unclear increases the likelihood of unintended harm. Rather than regular armies fighting each other, much of the violence was perpetrated by the force of not formally connected to the states. In part then, this is a subjective distinction. After all, many paramilitary forces view themselves as either adjunct or to existing to as future state. Refining then why it's not pragmatically tactical to have this kind of paramilitary group. Even if distinction between paramilitary and other forms of violence in Europe, for example, was not always clear, the fact remains that violence perpetrated by this kind of forces, other than the harms of the state, was a significant factor, for example, in World War I, and after peace has officially been declared after that. So this violence differed substantially from traditional military violence. First, with this, we can see that paramilitary forces violence
can often occur in undefined spaces of combat rather than more or less clearly outlined battlefields then. Second, the boundary between soldier and civilian was a porous one. Lacking an orderly conspicuous process, paramilitaries included men who moved back and forth between their civilian and military lives. Third, it was possible to switch sides as conflicts evolved. In famously multi-sided conflicts such as the eruptions in the Ukraine, individuals in Ukraine in World War I, individuals and units could and did switch loyalties. How could you ensure that this wouldn't happen? Finally, because of paramilitary conflicts were often fought on the grounds that were not clearly designated as a battle zone, the possibility of civilian casualties and death was considerably higher on your end. Take this for example, paramilitary violence was a widespread and common occurrence throughout the Europe and exhaustively categorizing every local conflict. So by that, very, very proud to oppose.
All right, thank the speaker for that speech. With that, it concludes the opening half of the debate. Moving on to the closing half, can I invite the member of government?
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. CG is going to do a few things in this debate. What are we going to do? Firstly, we're going to characterize what types of situations these types of when UN is likely going to use these peacekeeping force, and therefore why they're likely going to act in good ways. And we're going to give you 2 pieces of incentive analysis. Firstly, incentives on why the UN is likely going to use this responsibly and in strategic ways. And secondly, the analysis of paramilitary groups, which is going to take out the bulk of the OO case, which is mainly that it's going to lead to bad consequences overall, like the Wagner Group. But first on the framing. We say there's likely going to be strategic reasons why the UN is likely going to do this, because they're particularly incapable of doing certain things. We say there's a lot of reasons why UN is likely going to be incapable of doing things in the past. This looks like when paramilitary groups have specific technology that is exclusive from UN peacekeeping groups. This looks like drones who are able to take out certain spots and are likely a lot more innovative and often have more money being put into these technologies to make sure that tasks can be done efficiently. They're also likely going to be a lot more structured, which means that there's more accountability systems, and it makes sure that these tasks can be done in a more coordinated and well-done way. That is the trade-off, and unless you can prove an active harm on OO, that they're going to act bad in most of the scenarios, then you can't prove why the UN shouldn't have the ability to use this. But now onto our extension. What are we likely going to prove in this as CG? Firstly, what exactly is the incentive of the UN? We say that the UN is unlikely going to just use the paramilitary group as a way to exert their power. We say that the UN is one that's heavily scrutinized, using OO's own metrics. Because there's so many countries within the UN and they all have clashing types of interests, it means that individuals are likely going to scout on which paramilitary group is likely going to be the best for them. The heavily scrutinized factor also means that certain countries aren't always going to be able to have dominance over the group, because that's when you see more and more countries dropping out of the UN, criticizing the UN. So what is this likely going to be for? The UN is a stakeholder that's likely going to act in the best interest of all individuals and in the best interest of the globe overall. This means that you're unlikely to get some of the worst types of harms coming from OO. But what exactly is the paramilitary analysis that's likely going to be likely going to do the most damage to OO? Firstly, the main clash coming from the opening side was on this idea of coordination and which side is going to have better coordination. I'm going to tell you why we actually flip this argument and say why coordination is going to be much better. Our POI coming to OO was that because both sides have different types of countries and lots of different ideologies, we need to separate and base this down to the basic types of ideologies that people have. And it is difference between ideologically driven people and people who are driven by objectives and money. Why is this important? Because the UN peacekeeping group, no thank you, has had a history of human rights abuses. They're a group that's known for abusing their power because of how they place themselves better than the people who they're currently fighting for. This looks like a lot of the human rights violations, where there are often things like cases of sexual assault, often things like killing civilians, and times where it's very difficult for you to actually hold them accountable. So how exactly do we change this? We say when individuals are ideologically driven, they're more prone and have a greater propensity to do things like kill civilians, commit things like war crimes. If you inherently, as a volunteer, come to this country and want to join this proxy war, and you have such a strong xenophobia for this country, I think that's a point in which individuals are likely going to act in bad ways. This will never happen within a paramilitary group because it was never about volunteers or individuals. It was about a structure in which individuals acted upon orders and there was a stronger chain of command. This was the type of accountability measure that made sure that the worst types of crimes that the UN is known for isn't going to happen. Why is this important? It means that you prevent the UN losing their reputation and losing their ability to exert force in future scenarios. We say there's going to be lots of scenarios in the future where the UN has to do something in order to do things like provide aid, help refugees, do things like counterterrorism. We say when you have a bad reputation of the UN and the UN is being seen as someone who's violating orders, we say that's the tipping point towards the UN being invalid and unable to help individuals further down the line. This means that the most vulnerable people that could have been saved are now no longer saved because the UN is the stakeholder that's characterized as acting out of order and acting as a bad agent. I'll take the POI now.
Even in your best case, the UN has different beliefs. Adding another variable that is likely to be harmful is happening on your side. Prove why LO's 4 layers of analysis is not true.
I would say the fact that you can fire the paramilitary group and there's competition between paramilitary groups inherently holds them accountable. The fact that there's different types of paramilitary groups for different purposes means that there's going to be a clash and competition between each of them to make sure they don't have a bad reputation. We say these paramilitary groups are also likely going to be people who are much more able to do the things that they needed. The harm that's pointed out from OG isn't fully weaponized. What exactly is the harm that's likely going to happen on the opposition side? We say that individuals who fail because of the lack of organization, who fail because of the lack of ability to keep things in check, are likely going to be the people who suffer the most. Firstly, this looks like the civilians on the ground who are harmed when the UN peacekeeping forces directly choose to engage with the people within their civil war. You need individuals who understand the consequences and that have experience on what exactly is likely to happen. On your side, you have individuals from different countries with different perspectives and different agendas, which means that the UN peacekeeping force is one that's likely going to be largely separated, largely diluted. We can actually flip this analysis. We say when people are in these peacekeeping forces and when they're volunteers joining these groups, they're more likely going to act out against the UN. All of the things they said about the Wagner group coming from OO are also symmetric and might happen even worse within UN peacekeeping forces on their side when there's a lack of accountability from top to bottom. That's why the worst types of harms and your ability for the UN to be known as a peacekeeping force further down the line is likely going to deteriorate at the point in which you don't hire paramilitary groups. Very proud to propose.
All right, Senate Speaker for that fine speech. Or can we now invite the member of the opposition? Here.
POIs in the chat. I will try to take one. And he can pronounce, right? Okay. Just a moment. I'll set this up. Adjudicator, we win this debate immediately because we do the thing that's logically prior to everything that everyone was trying to claim in this debate, which is explain to you what does the UN look like? Because there's a lot of assertions the UN is a good actor, they contain a lot of states that all want to fight each other, or like maybe they all are good, or they're super smart, things of that nature. I'm sorry, like, let's talk about what the UN is, right? The UN is dog shit. That's to say that the UN in the current status quo is one of the most unregulated organizations to ever exist, right? That, like, when CG comes up and tells you that, oh, you're not able to regulate their own fucking, like, peacekeeping forces. I'm sorry, then how are they regulating paramilitaries? I'm sorry, paramilitaries with their own, like, functioning structures, paramilitaries that, like, hardly respect the UN in the first instance. I'm sorry, like, it is very hard to believe any of the government case at the very first instance. Let's talk to you about what UN incentives are. Who is the UN liable to? Well, themselves. Because why? The UN is made up of member states. The member states regulate themselves, the member states. What does this necessarily mean? It means that first of all, there's an incentive to cover up. That's to say that you're probably not going to self-report when you commit atrocities and crimes. Note that like the only reason we know that they've committed raping and pillaging in many of like many of the African conflicts they intervened in is because of like expose articles talking to like the groups that like they have actively affected on the ground, right? This is some information that's very hard to get. But second of all, do you realize that for them to regulate themselves, they would have to like come out in council and bring up a motion to criticize their own nations. Note that peacekeeping forces under the current status quo are made up of like many of the current like countries' own like volunteer fighters, things of that nature. What this fundamentally means is they are very unwilling to criticize themselves. They've said something like, oh, but these nations have clashing interests, so they will regulate each other. No, the UN tends to be very Western-centered because first of all, many nations rely on like NATO trade agreements with the West, or otherwise like the US to support them in terms of aid, allyship, or otherwise. This means that very few people like are willing to go against the Western powers that tend to run the UN. But second of all, nobody wants to be under scrutiny. That's to say, to bring scrutiny to the UN is to bring scrutiny to yourself and your own inadequacies. And we tell you many of the UN nations have inadequacies in terms of corruption and other human rights violations. Asking for an investigation is asking for yourself to be damned. What does this mean? It means that the UN is an unregulated bad actor. I'll give you a few more reasons why. First of all, recognize that the figureheads that are directly in charge of the Peacekeeping Council have no real accountability, right? The UN is not a democratically elected like government. The UN is essentially like figureheads, right? The head of the Security Council has one term and one term alone. That say they hold on to the role, and at the end they give a report and say, oh, I did great, and then they leave, right? There's no real benefit to becoming a like major UN member, no benefit to being in the council. There's no real reason why you want to hold this power, so there's no reason to really maintain it or uphold integrity. Second of all, I've told you can cover up most of these crimes because it's really hard to monitor these regions. Note that they never really told us how they're going to monitor any of these paramilitaries and things of that nature, especially when they're in regions that are like conflict torn. I'm not sure how you're getting cameras to watch them at all times, or if you're sending your peacekeeping groups in to like monitor them. Like, one, why are they going to put up with this? Two, why aren't they like, you know, just killing off your guys and calling it a freak accident? Three, why are your peacekeepers like not completely corrupt or like incentivized to actually be just, right? Third of all, we tell you that UN nations are often reluctant to supply troops in the very first instance. This is because there's very little practical benefit from doing so, because like you probably get a lot more political benefit from, I don't know, forming trade relations or like going on the globe and like giving speeches and things of that nature. No, the SI might try to say, oh, there's an incentive to be good. Note that like being good is like just fundamentally hard for a lot of these nations because it requires a little regulation and investment to the UN that many nations don't want to put up with, right? Fourth of all, UN members have incentives to grandstand in order to gain press and show that they're upholding UN conventions and humanitarian pledges. But no, this doesn't mean that they have to perform well. What does this mean? This means that when they came up and told us that, oh, but you can actually just not send like these peacekeepers if they're bad, or these paramilitary groups if they're bad. No, you cannot. What's going to happen is that the US is going to say, hey, maybe we should help out in Rwanda. Hey, we should help out in like New Guinea and something like that. And everyone's going to say, yeah, this is great because it upholds the convention that we passed. And then they're going to pass it on to like the Security Council, who has like piss zero like peacekeeping troops. And they're like, shit, I guess I got to hire whatever local military exists. Note that paramilitaries were not well characterized in this debate. Let's really briefly characterize them, because note there isn't like an infinite amount of paramilitaries just laying around. Paramilitary groups are often not imported from other regions. You're not importing a Venezuelan paramilitary into Africa. What you're doing is you're hiring a local paramilitary. No, there's a very few amount of local paramilitaries because, like, you know, getting arms, getting enough trained soldiers to form a paramilitary and forming an organization requires a certain amount of funds, and in the first instance. But second of all, these groups tend to be like leftover soldiers from like remaining conflicts, wars, or like soldiers that are like in uncontrolled regions that like control their own territories and like very own small villages and things of that nature. What this means means is that, first of all, they don't tend to necessarily be the greatest of actors, but second of all, you don't really have a choice if you're using paramilitaries, right? But what this also means, because of what I just told you about UN grandstanding, is it means that what you do is you have to fulfill all these requests to like intervene in nations. And what happens in the current status quo is that because we only have like one peacekeeping group with very few soldiers, we send them into one region every 3 years. Maybe they like fuck over the region once every 3 years. No, in their case, they're fucking over like 10 regions every year, right? We tell you that's like just arguably worse. But lastly, we tell you like the ability to throw away and just strawman these groups in like the worst case for our side. It's probably still quite bad insofar as the UN doesn't have to take accountability for any of their actions. What's the impact of this? First of all, yes, the UN is bad on outside, the peacekeeping is bad on outside. It's just marginally worse on the other side. At the point at which you have a lot of these paramilitary groups essentially being pushed to intervene in these types of missions, and they have no accountability, and they're unregulated, and they essentially screw over many of these regions. What happens as peacekeeping wilts on our side? Why does peacekeeping wilt? I already told you that there's a reluctance from many nations to send these soldiers in the very first instance, right? And we tell you like it's just costly to them and very little benefit. What happens? Instead, we think private intervention and aid occurs, right? This looks like the US, UK, Germany intervening in regions that are local to them or that are like convergent on their allies and things of that nature. We think it just means you send your own military. There's a lot more accountability there because it's directly reflective on you. There's also a lot more benefit if you're successful in the region. We tell you because once again, the benefit goes directly to you. It makes you look like a greater superpower, things of the nature. Now, dealing with the stuff of paramilitaries, why are they like all necessarily bad? No, our opening has told you that, oh, they cause more conflict. I'll go a bit further. I'll explain to you that paramilitaries are bad because in the first instance, the way they form is fundamentally bad, as I've already explained. But second of all, they are very hard to regulate in terms of their structures. But also third of all, because of like what their side also concedes, which is knowledge of the region, and from being in the region, as I've told you that they necessarily probably come from, they probably do have investment in the region to a specific side. That's to say they were probably disenfranchised by one side or one opposition. They probably like hate certain ethnic groups. That means they're probably likely to genocide certain groups. Also, because you antagonize the other group as your enemies, when you take over their camps and villages, you're likely to do things like pillage and rape and things of that nature, regardless, because you dehumanize them, because you see them as your enemies at all instances. Note, this is something that's a lot more of a proximate harm to the people most directly affected, which are the civilians in this debate, who are killed off by these militaries, who are genocided, who are raped. All these sorts of things that occur on their side do not occur on ours. Thank you.
All right, I will thank the speaker for that speech. Can I now invite the government whip? Here.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Thank you. Pyong is in chat. Give me a sec. The way closing government enters this debate is very simple. Firstly, we tell you what exactly is the incentive of paramilitary groups and why they're likely to have incentives that are beneficial for the collective benefit of society. But secondly, what exactly is a UN incentive? I know that this deals with closing opposition because the bulk of closing opposition's case is that the United Nations is unregulated, so therefore the paramilitary groups are also going to be unregulated. So given this, I want to talk about firstly, what exactly is the incentive of paramilitary group? So member of government tell you two things. Firstly, that these paramilitary groups are bonded with the United Nations through monetary incentives and economic incentives. But this is not just as what opening government tries to say, how there's an economic bond between United Nations and the paramilitary groups, and how the United Nations can hold the paramilitary groups accountable through just like kicking them out because and then the paramilitary groups are unable to get money. It's something that's more sophisticated. Member of government told you that the paramilitary organizations are likely going to care about reputation, especially where you're competing within the market where every paramilitary group probably already have bad reputation from the very first place. So it's even more important for these paramilitary groups to care about their reputation, because if they have good reputation, if they cooperate well with a charitable actor like the United Nations, they're more likely able to stand out within the market. They're more likely able to have more opportunities to make money. So to a large extent, that means that we're able to hold these paramilitary groups accountable at the end of the day. But also secondly, I think it's not only about the economic bond, right? So but because other nations are also able to hold accountable these paramilitary groups at the end of the day. So I think to a large extent, the incentive of paramilitary groups can be controlled by the United Nations, and the United Nations probably is able to regulate the paramilitary group, right? But what exactly does closing opposition say? Closing opposition says that there are probably like a certain paramilitary group that dictates a certain region, so there's no competition. I don't think that's true, right? Because probably there are many paramilitary groups that exist and are competing with each other within local regions. But also, like I think universally there are many professional paramilitary groups that can go on that can go to like different regions. I don't think that's something that's extremely important and relevant to this argument. But how exactly does this? Why is this analysis extremely important for closing government? The reason why is twofold. Firstly, this deals with opening government because this is an exclusive government, exclusive extension that came out from closing government, because opening government says that doesn't really engage with the idea about the incentive paramilitary groups. They try to assume that these paramilitary groups are able to be controlled, but they don't provide the analysis. If opening government is unable to provide analysis as to why the incentive of paramilitary groups is likely can be controlled by the United Nations, I don't think they're able to get the benefit that they talk about, because insofar opening government only talks about how these paramilitary groups are extremely efficient. If they lack the analysis of incentive, they're unable to get that benefit at the end of the day. But secondly, what exactly is the comparative under opposition side? Because opposition side doesn't really provide a reasonable counterfactual, and it's already too late for them to talk about it within opposition with. So I'm going to assume that the counterfactual under opposition side is that you are likely going to use peacekeeping forces. But here's the thing, because opposition side already attacked the United Nations as an unregulated actor at the end of the day. So given this, presumably under this house, the United Nations is also an unregulated organization. Insofar the United Nations is an unregulated organization, how are they able to regulate the peacekeepers? They don't have they don't respond, and they don't have any counterfactual, so they're extremely unable to solve the problems, because conflict still exists. And when under opposition side, where they cannot use paramilitary groups, where the only solution is peacekeeping groups, who are likely going to harm far more people, right? But the second thing that closing opposition says is that the United Nations is a Western-centric organization. The reason why this is extremely harmful to the case is either that the United Nations is an organization that is consisted of people who believe in the same narrative, believe in the same ideology, so there's no internal conflict. But because the United Nations is too Western-centric, likely they're gonna have bias, likely they're unable to complete their missions and without bias, and likely they're gonna harm more people under their house, or that United Nations is going to have internal conflict. But given this, I want to talk about the second issue as to what exactly is a United Nations incentive. So again, closing opposition says that the United Nations is a completely unregulated organization. But before Kanya, yes, I'll take a point. Go ahead.
If you agree that there's very few capable paramilitary groups that exist, that means it heightens the likelihood of paramilitary groups that are capable already align with other states that may take advantage of you, meaning you heighten the possible harms that exist on your side. Engage.
Yeah. So I think there's very simple solutions, because paramilitary groups doesn't have to be controlled by government. They can also be private, and also moreover, likely I'm going to explain this later on. So I think these paramilitary groups doesn't always have to be fighting within conflicts, having internal interest conflicts within the state and the United Nations. I don't think that's 100% the case. There are far more other cases in which paramilitary groups are extremely essential. I'm going to talk about this. So what exactly is the United Nations? What exactly does the United Nations look like, right? So I think the reason why the United Nations can be regulated and is far more accountable than other actors that are trying to help other people is because, firstly, they're largely scrutinized. This came out from member of government, so they're largely scrutinized by the media. They're scrutinized by other countries, but also because there's multiple different countries. So it means that every country is going to scrutinize every mission. There's large amount of scrutiny. So I don't think that the United Nations is an unregulated organization at the end of the day. But also, moreover, the veto system exists, so that means no single country is able to dictate the decisions within Security Council, decisions that the United Nations make. So to a large extent, that means that the United Nations is probably an accountable actor that has many mechanisms to deal with internal interest of conflict of interest, right? But also, moreover, I think the people who work for the United Nations probably believe in some kind of ideology that's charitable. That's why they went to the United Nations and try to help as much people as possible. But lastly, and importantly, I think oftentimes in the United Nations is more about things that are not about fighting proxy wars, fighting conflicts, or like supporting nations or fighting civil wars, etc. Oftentimes, the United Nations is doing things that can be agreed universally, such as saving hostages, counterterrorism, or like maybe like examples of like providing humanitarian aid. The reason why this is important is because this deals with closing opposition. Because in cases where you need conflict and when you're fighting wars, you don't actually need these paramilitary groups. You can also put in like peacekeeping groups, because presumably that's also the same thing as compared to opposite what happens on the opposition side. But in times where you actively need efficiency, when you actively need to save hostages and do things that doesn't include bias, you need these paramilitary groups to exist. But so for these reasons, so proud to propose.
All right, we thank the speaker for that speech. May we now invite the opposition whip to close the debate as a whole. Here.
Hi everyone, my name is Ellen Wang. My pronouns are she, her. If you have APLI, please put it in the chat. Please do not verbally say it. Starting my speech in 3, 2, oh wait, sorry, let me get my timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Neither OG nor CG are able to win this debate because they haven't contended with the material brought out to you at Tino about why there's so little accountability mechanisms, both in terms of the UN regulating itself and in terms of the UN being able to hold paramilitary groups accountable. This means that because of this lack of atrocity, because of the hatred that paramilitary groups are likely to have for specific groups of people, because they've been born out of conflict-torn regions, because they've been descended from fractured military groups, we think that the atrocities are done to civilians, the sorts of harms that they're going to suffer through rapes and pillages are the worst harms and the most severe harms. They're probably likely to happen. That's what you should weigh most heavily. OO similarly isn't able to win on ideology or perverse incentives because they haven't been able to show how these perverse incentives are going to lead to outcomes that are worse than the direct atrocities that are borne by people who have had their human dignity stripped from them. Okay, what was the extension brought out to you? Tino brought out to you a few really good things. I'm going to build on it quickly first by explaining the UN lack of accountability of themselves and also of the paramilitary. Take note that I'm allowed to say this because it responds to new material that came out at CG about why the UN is accountable. We think the UN is accountable. We tell you that firstly, probably no member state of the United States is probably going to be from the conflict-torn regions that we're talking about. That means they are likely to have the intelligence groups that OG and CG, the intelligence and information that OG and CG are available. That's probably not likely to happen. Be realistic about it. They're also not likely to get this information from allies because those allies, by OG's own admission, by OO's admission, are probably going to be from states like Russia, which means that the sorts of information that they give to the UN probably isn't going to be credible at the point at which you're supporting paramilitary groups that they have a stake in. Secondly, these paramilitary groups are likely to be splintered because they have descended from histories of conflict. That means they're probably going to be difficult to pin down. And thirdly, they're likely to be underground. It's probably going to be really difficult for the UN to be able to investigate thoroughly into the histories of these paramilitary groups, short of just asking those groups themselves. Okay, what else did we give you as our extension? We told you secondly that nations are often reluctant to send US peacekeeping groups. The better comparative that we stand for is individual states which have more accountability stepping in to do peacekeeping. Thirdly, we told you that paramilitary groups probably aren't good actors because there's a scarcity of paramilitary groups, there's a lack of information about them, and also most of them have hatred towards certain groups because of that conflict. Number 4, we tell you that what this leads to is civilian atrocities. That's extremely bad. Number 5, we tell you that this is exacerbated because of UN incentives to do grandstanding, which firstly hurts the civilians because it means they're likely to choose paramilitary groups that probably won't be held accountable and harm civilians a lot. But secondly, we tell you that it stops better accountable forces from individual states coming in. But even if that isn't true, it's still worse than just having the UN force because of so little accountability on these paramilitary groups. Okay, how do we beat each of the individual teams? On OO, firstly, we tell you that we beat OO in terms of weighing, because at OO's best, their material is about how paramilitary groups have perverse incentives to side with other states, such as Russia, which drives more conflict. The problem with OO's case is that they haven't explained to you substantially how much more conflict this is going to be, or what this conflict is going to look like, or why it's going to be categorically worse than the conflict that's already occurring in those regions, or what it would mean for people on the ground. Comparatively, the impacts that we've shown to you at TNO are likely to be a lot worse, because we've proven to you that human rights abuses are probably going to be rampant from the UN forces, but also from the paramilitary groups that they hire. We proved to you that was likely. We tell you that OO said that they raised the possibility of civilian deaths and these sorts of human rights abuses, but they didn't explain why it would happen. TNO gave you in-depth analysis as to why human rights abuses are going to happen. This is much worse than the sort of conflict that they've tried to rest their case on, because it's the most proximate harm. The conflict is probably going to be there either way, whereas human rights abuses are atrocities. And finally, the conflict can't end unless human rights are upheld, because the abuse that's borne by these people will create intergenerational trauma that will further entrench these nations in cycles of conflict that they don't deserve. Okay, on CG then. CG's main push was to say that the UN is probably going to be accountable and also hold the paramilitary groups accountable. If we can win on this, then we win on their metric about improving the UN image, about upholding human rights and stuff. But not that we're not just winning on image of improving human rights, but also the actual upholding of human rights. What did CG tell you? They told you, and this was in the speech that just came, so I can respond to it, they told you that the UN would probably have veto powers. This doesn't work, because what is the UN going to be vetoing, right? The decision to intervene in these places. Tina already gave you reasons why the UN has a lot of international scrutiny and demand from various places to intervene and do peacekeeping and make things better again. They have an incentive to grandstand. They're probably not going to veto the decision to intervene. If it's vetoing the specific paramilitary groups, that's probably not going to happen, because what this would require is a member of the United Nations bringing a motion to actively condemn itself. We tell you that this probably won't happen. They told you that there's going to be media, bad press and stuff. The problem is that this doesn't actually hurt UN members, because UN members aren't held accountable by a political system. It only weakens the UN, because people don't trust the UN anymore, but it doesn't actually affect the actual people who compose the UN, so it's not an accountability mechanism. Okay, why can't the UN hold paramilitary groups accountable? CG told you that they can fire the paramilitary group. This doesn't work. Actually, first I'll take a POI from opening.
Even if we buy your assertion, which kind of knifes OO's characterization of a robust and principled actor, that there aren't sufficient checks and balances, you admit the comparative remains intervention. So why do we still get the plethora of benefits that we talked about at OG in regards to a trained military force, one who is able to know the local layout? How do you respond to that?
Okay, so firstly, it's not a knife, because the OO's case was about the principles that the UN was talking about. We tell you about how this actually manifests in interactions with paramilitary groups. Okay. They're not able to just fire the paramilitary groups because it relies on a reporting system which likely doesn't exist. Even if the UN can't regulate, itself, it's probably not able to regulate the paramilitary group either. This is something that the CG conceded. We tell you that it's overall, this means that it's worse on the CG's main metric, which is the UN grandstanding. Paramilitary groups abuses and stuff happen a lot. That's really bad. CG loses the debate on that itself. Quickly on OG. OG's case relies on the UN being able to make good decisions. We've beaten that without analysis about why good paramilitary groups aren't available and why UN accountability is horrible. That means we win on human rights.
All right. We thank that speaker for that speech. And with that, the novice finals has concluded. So thank you everyone for the debate.